Good evening. This is Pat McCarthy from the Huawei Cybersecurity Transparency Centre here in Brussels, and it's great to have this opportunity to join this very interesting conference on cybersecurity, focusing on the age for digital world. So it's really very interesting to be chatting to you this evening. The topic I'll be speaking to is enabling trustworthy AI in the intelligent digital world. Our Cybersecurity Transparency Centre here in Brussels that I'm in this evening, we're dedicated to the theme of openness, transparency and collaboration. And there's no better way than engaging with the community that we have assembled at this very interesting Arab Cybersecurity Conference to have this discussion. This evening I'll be chatting about three topics: trustworthy AI, AI security and privacy protection, and share with you some intelligent digital world innovation and how some of these models can be applied in a few regions that I'm familiar with. When I'm speaking about trustworthy AI, some of the material I'll be drawing on will be from the role that I have where I act as an advisor to a university research institute in Ireland called Insight, the Centre for Data Analytics, and they've one of the larger analytics and AI research centres in Europe. And I'll be leveraging some of the material from that to provide a context for this topic. So when we look at trustworthy AI, what's the value of AI? Some definitions. I'll talk about some of the human factors. We talk about AI as being artificial intelligence, but what's the role of the human? And some of the challenges, standards, and regulations around this topic. So first of all, I know this is a managerial track and probably everybody's familiar with this, but just to remind ourselves of the context for why and what's the business value for AI. Really, AI can bring tremendous value in a whole bunch of domains, whether it's data processing, whether it's IoT and sensing objects, process automation in the Industry 4.0, helping with more deeper analytics on decision support. We've seen the power of conversational AI with devices in our homes and in our using our devices in the mobile. And then robotics will be very dependent on leveraging AI. So there's lots of business value, a lot of reasons why the industry is very excited by AI and why it's looking to leverage it going forward. And this slide is from Gartner in 2019. When we look at AI defined, Gartner also defined it as artificial intelligence applies advanced analytics and logic-based techniques, including machine learning to interpret events, support and automate decisions and take actions. And AI, there's a lot of hype in the industry about AI, and it's a lot of people talk about it and want to know more about it. But if you look at it from an academic perspective, it sits in the field of data science. There, along with some other very popular and key areas like big data, but there's also small data, fresh data, lots of different aspects to data to be considered. And underneath those respective technologies in AI, you'll have machine learning and deep neural networks. And in data, you'll have data mining and deep learning. And these collaborate, and you'll see it in the process of how data is used to train AI, and also used, obviously, to serve AI, to serve out insight. And ultimately, when we talk about what we're doing here is we're taking data to create insights. And that could also be analytics, business intelligence. A lot of AI isn't just machine learning, but it's also leveraging mathematical statistical models and data visualization. So I thought this is a useful slide from quorum.com. An interesting article which is there. One word, I think about automation, and I talk about how compute, data and algorithms really are some of the bedrock technologies that are. I'm going to talk about that more in this presentation. But it's not just about technology, it's also about people. And this slide, which comes from the Hierarchy of Needs and article published by Towards Data Science, is a really useful slide in my view to show the different roles of AI in the industry. because when we come to talk about security and privacy protection, different skills are needed at different levels to really implement AI through the life cycle. Collecting information, moving and storing it, then exploring and transforming data, aggregating and labeling it, and then learning to learn and optimize. And AI technology is a key part of driving that intelligence. And we talk about the community of software developers are now complemented by a community of data engineers, and then by a community of data scientists, analysts, who are people who can use AI, but maybe are not actually creating the AI algorithms themselves, leveraging AI from various platforms. And then we have the deep experts, the research scientists, the core data scientists. Is how can we enable more and more people to use AI to drive those intelligence, the value I just described, and leveraging existing platforms, existing algorithms to make that happen. So it's worth considering when you think about AI, you've got to think about the human factor in how it's built and delivered to customers as regards the overall challenge of AI. When we start to talk about security, I come from Europe. I'm based in our Brussels centre, and in Europe, which is the centres in each of our countries. And then we have a standards organization, a global standards organization called ETSI, and they're leading an interesting initiative called Secure AI, which is looking at the challenge and standards of how to standardize AI going forward. So this is a European perspective that I will provide to discuss AI cybersecurity in a bit more detail. If you want to know a little bit more about the ENISA view on ENISA AI threat landscape, published in December 2020, a useful model with a good summary of the overall threat landscape for AI. There are other views around the world in NISD in USA and others from China, and different countries around the world are looking at their own specific view of the challenges. This one I found useful because it has a nice summary, and it focuses around some of the key challenges around the data attack, model attack, and supply chain. It looks at the AI threats across different areas and different elements of what can cause and be a challenge to AI, which isn't just the technology, but it can be, what happens if somebody makes a mistake in the overall process? What happens if been changed that could affect the way AI could process things, or indeed by attacking the models itself? What is clear and what's good and published in the ENISA document is it looks at it from an AI lifecycle. And then leveraging the feature selection of AI so that you can have model training where the AI is trained, and which is a recursive process, and testing to ensure it's meeting the goal that's needed, and then where it's deployed to the actual implementation to give the business understanding or the automation that's required. And in the ENISA document, they focus a lot on the AI actors, the AI lifecycle, and the asset taxonomy. Think about the AI lifecycle, something which I'll talk about in the second half of the presentation, is a lot around the AI shared responsibility. Because the view that we have is that this is something that no one vendor on their own can resolve. The whole industry needs to focus on the AI shared responsibility in order to achieve trustworthy AI. And I'll discuss that in a bit more detail. So when we look at the security assets, they mentioned a few, like the models, the data, and supply chain. But there's also the environment and the tools for the environment for the actual AI platform, the process for the AI pipeline, and various artifacts and how they're stored, and then obviously the actors and stakeholders and how they can access and support a solution. So this is how the ANISA looked at the overall AI asset repository and what needs to be protected. So if you look at the old world of just pure computing, which was focused on software code, processing data to deliver capability, now we have additional things that need to be protected as part of the overall AI security model, particularly the data, the models, and how the supply chain of AI is introduced. To get into more detail on this, another good reference I would point you towards is the ETSI Secure AI initiative. Now, what's great about this initiative is there's many participants from the industry, from universities, from various technology organizations, which are focusing on how to have different work items so that we can break down the challenge of AI and how to standardize it and look at it across different aspects. Recently, at Security Week, there was an update published, and there'll be more published going forward as regards to status. But some of the highlights, for example, the Secure AI Problem Statement was published in December 2020, which provides a very good starting point about what is the challenge of AI from a more technology perspective, and look at the specific problem statement that needs to be addressed. That's been followed up now with a mitigation strategy report, which has been published in 2021 in April, and was the highlight of the ETSI Security Week. Huawei is actually one of the key participants in supporting this overall team and was the co-author for the mitigation strategy report. But there are other teams really looking at very interesting things like the AI threat ontology, the data supply chain, the security testing, hardware in a secure AI, explainability and transparency, and privacy aspects. So there's more to come, and this is a very good initiative helping to bring the industry together to have a really good view about how to progress and secure AI. In the problem statement that was published December last year, here's a link to the report. One of the things I particularly liked was the way they show the pipeline, and they show the emphasis on the training phase around the data acquisition, the data curation, the model design, and then going into the implementation of build, train, and test, which is a recursive model. And then that gets to deployed, where then it has to use real data, which is also curated, and then deliver results. And one of the things about AI is it can continue to learn from the deployment phase, and you can look at bringing some of that feedback back into the model so that you can update it going forward. But from a security and privacy protection perspective, the things that you would be worried about would be, how can this AI model be poisoned with bad data or somebody interfering with the algorithms? How can you avoid input attack that could cause challenges, or backdoor attacks, or various reverse engineering where somebody could either steal the AI algorithms or affect the supply chain by introducing changes. So this is another level of work that's important to be understood, and this particular document, I think, is a very good step to describe the problem statement. Then that was followed up by the migration strategies and recommendations for AI, and it kind of separated them into what are the attack types in training and inference, as I mentioned earlier. So examples of poisoning attacks, which could affect some of these will be mitigation approaches to the model enhancement, and others would be more model agnostic that needs to be addressed as part of the overall process. So each of these are kind of topics in their own right and would require a longer presentation, but I point them to you because I think it's a good report to look to if you're not already looking at it and want to get a better understanding around the mitigation strategies that you could focus on. So then more recently, we've had the Trustworthy AI regulation in Europe. This is a new act that's been being brought out by the EU. It's a proposed act that will probably take about 2 years to get into full deployment. But when we think of the European contribution to the industry around GDPR, which focused on data regulation and data protection, now with the AI Act, it will focus a lot on AI regulation and in particular data governance. And one of the challenges in this is in some ways there's a little bit of conflict because data protection and GDPR is very much around locking down data, ensuring data subject rights, make it right to be forgotten, and all those other aspects in GDPR. Whereas AI needs to leverage data, but needs to do that in a way that's going to be GDPR compliant. And for that, the shared responsibility is going to be very important to understand how AI is implemented across the entire ecosystem. As part of the overall regulatory framework, the EU has defined areas of unacceptable risk where they don't want and won't accept AI to be used in Europe for certain areas, or areas of high risk, such as in medical systems or in transport and critical infrastructure, where they have specific demands on the industry to how do you regulate and how does the AI get explained as part of the overall process, and there will be compliance requirements going forward, in particular supporting things like CE marks and safety in various industries. Where there is an industry initiative around safety, like in automotive or in devices, the AI will fall into that and be part of the overall CE scheme. But there's still some other areas of AI, like chatbots, for example, that have some interaction with Europe, with humans, and would have some limited risk, and they need to be declared, but won't have a huge burden. And then there's other areas of AI that would be considered out of scope. Like, for example, one of the areas during the presentations from the AI Act leaders was mentioning using AI to help solve and detect problems in operational systems that isn't touching human data or data subject data. That could be considered part of minimal risk, but it's not quite defined yet in the Act. And that's one of the overall things that people have spoken about is it's important that as we go forward, we have clearer definitions about what's in the Act in different areas, and I'm sure that's all going to come based on the feedback that's coming from the industry. So there is an overall push to trustworthy AI, but it has to be based on clear regulation, has to be based on a clear definition of the technology stacks and an understanding of the AI model. I noticed in some of the other presentations which I was watching through the conference that there was a mention of some of these topics and the layered approach and introducing security at different levels of the layer. All those elements will form part of an overall model. And I'll come back to that later. So that just provides a bit of a context. And for those of you who are AI experts, apologies. You probably are well on top of some of that already. But as this is a managerial track, and it's my first presentation at the event, I kind of wanted to level set the next session. So I'm going to talk now about AI, a shared responsibility, and a risk-based approach that we've been advocating for the industry. In 2019, Huawei published an interesting paper called Thinking Ahead about AI Security and Privacy Protection, and shared that within the industry as a generic approach for a shared responsibility model, looking at the whole cycle from data collection through solution provision, through deployment, and customers. And it looked at within that, what are the elements of the basic layer, technology layer, the roles of application developers, whether that's AI engineers, data scientists, and how that would fit with the solution and service providers. And this is a useful document because it helps to provide a sharing, because one of our views responsibility. So it's good that this is becoming a popular topic across the focus around how data in Europe should be managed. Would like to leverage that model. The key point of this overall presentation is that AI security and privacy protection is a shared that we all must follow, like the AI Act I just mentioned, and there'll be different acts introduced in every country around the world. Then there's the full stack AI technology, which is like the enabling technology layer, the core technology layers that are needed to implement AI coming from the technology community and providers. And then we have the full stack AI solutions, which is the world of the solution providers, service providers, who are really servicing the needs of data scientists, application developers, application engineers, who are building applications and AI to achieve that automation goals that we mentioned at the start of the presentation. But none of this is possible unless the data collectors really follow proper GDPR type principles around user authorization, protecting data subject rights, implementing data security, access controls, and ultimately the rules that will be applied in the data spaces. The deployers are the people who are looking to commercially deploy solutions. But in this presentation, I'll talk about the deployers' challenge in AI and cloud, edge, and device. And then ultimately, we're supporting consumers or customers to support their needs with applications that will bring value to the industry. So some of the key areas of shared responsibility across this would be how data governance is managed, privacy protection, and ultimately compliance is achieved. So again, this is really very close to the paper we published in 2019, but it gives you some additional aspects that are worth considering now that we're in 2021. So first of all, I mentioned the AI deployers deployment scenarios because I think from the technology and cybersecurity perspective, this is when it really kicks in as regards some of the decisions that are really important to be made. So in the industry, depending on what application is required, if people are using their mobile device, they could be using AI for unlocking the phone. That's a very simple application that most people would use. But other applications will be useful to help support AI, speech recognition and other areas, and recognition of other objects. So that's what we would call device AI. Then there's a growing need for edge AI, where some devices may not have the onboard AI intelligence, like a simple robot, might need power from an edge AI platform that would give it the intelligence needed to do it, or indeed to control a number of robots. For example, if they're working together in a warehouse, no one robot would have the overall view. The overall edge AI platform running in the campus or in the Industry 4.0 would have that intelligence. It might also be needed at the edge for latency reasons, security reasons, and also for roaming. If you want to have fast roaming, you may need to have edge AI capability. And then you have cloud AI, where a lot of training takes place, but also applications can run there supporting not just the edge, but also supporting devices. So the deployers aren't just looking to deploy AI into the cloud. They could be deploying it into device, edge, and cloud, and in particular following a combination model in some of these scenarios. So I think I want to just raise that as something to be considered, because the security and privacy protection needs to be considered in that aspect. And obviously the connectivity needs to be protected. The networking is going to be important, not just within the cloud service provider environment, which I know was mentioned a lot in one of the presentations. I think a good context to think about the deployment scenario in more detail. Another thing I've added in this slide is a bit more detail around the layered AI technology stack. So in the layered AI technology stack for cloud, you would typically be looking at like the networking layer, the computing layer, algorithm layer, whether it's algorithms trained or training, APIs and data tools to support the data scientists and data engineers using platforms. And then you have on the next stage, which is more the full stack AI solution, the application layer and data layer. And I color those in two different colors because there's a boundary there where the data is controlled in the full stack AI platform and cannot be seen by the technology providers. And even within that layer, the technology platform providers will be encrypting the data so that the up on the stack. So I believe that layering is important, and but it's also important when we think about privacy to think about data protection. Algorithms, computing and networking layer, and then or an application running in the cloud, for example, and then you would have a data controller, typically the customer, but also there'll be data controllers for data spaces who need to ensure that the data has an overall data control and give permission to data processors to do things on their behalf. And then you have ultimately the data subjects and the rights that we need to protect for users and people. So I have some examples of the solution providers there in people like AI solution providers, application developers, cloud service providers, as illustrative examples of solution providers. And then technology providers kind of follow the layering of the algorithm and data tools, computing and networking. Again, this is high level. It's just to provide a context. In more detail can be provided and can definitely be discussed going forward. In the 2019 paper, there is a lot of very interesting ideas presented. And one of the things I did in the last few months is I represented it in a single slide. One of the sections describes the application risk and the need that as you have more application risk, that you need to consider having more cybersecurity and privacy protection capability. So for example, if you look at it from an application risk perspective, you would have data analytics, you'd have diagnostic explainable analytics as a next level. You could then have conditional predictive analytics, which is looking at the future for recommended systems, for example. And then a level of high automation assisted decision, which is where autonomous driving cars are today. And then a full autonomous decision action making, which would be needed for robots because they need to operate in that way. And for full autonomous mobility in the future with autonomous cars will become more and more of this. But this is a high bar to get to because as you look at the challenge going across the piece, as you move up the stack, you need to do more. You know, at the very baseline, everybody needs to have trustworthy and controlled data sharing. That's like a given. And I'll explain these terms in a bit more detail in the next slide. Then I put result explainability next because I've seen in every project I've been involved with that there's a demand for explain how the AI has been achieved, and more that's required. And when you look at the intent of the European AI Act, a lot of that focus is around explaining AI in the context of its been use and matching that explainability to different domains. Then you have the model self-protection, which goes back to some of the things I mentioned earlier in the Secure AI initiative with ETSI, and also in that initiative they looked at system traceability around protecting some of the models, and then ultimately continuous dynamic self-adaptation to the environment. So I kind of give you an example of that, where, for example, the robots that would get sent out into outer space to the moon or Mars, for example, in the Mars, like there's a 10-minute lag, a very long lag, sorry, much longer, for signals to come to the Earth. So we can't control them. So the robots have to make their own decisions as regards landing and flying, as we've seen more recently. And that's a kind of an example of adapting an environment and having that capability. But there's a long road to get to that. And also, we need to get to some common definitions. When I share this with my colleagues and some other external advisors, can we all have a shared view of what, for example, data analysis is about? I've looked to put some simple definitions as a proposal. For example, analytic intelligence talks about what happened. Explainable intelligence with explainability and transparency models. You should have a better view about why did it happen. Then adversarial intelligence could look to how you could defend from adversarial attack on future, what will happen. And if you're going to have a system that's really giving recommendations for critical activities, you're really going to need to have very strong model self-protection capability. And then for high automation intelligence, you're going to be automated with data labeling and algorithm and model watermarking to protect the supply chain, in addition to doing everything else that I just mentioned. And then the ultimate is fully autonomous intelligence, where the system is autonomous, solves problems, has self-healing, and it protects itself from adversarial supply chain and environmental attack. This model overall actually isn't that dissimilar to what you would see in the autonomous driving industry, looking at how autonomous cars are different levels for automation. And indeed, other initiatives on it, for example, the TM Forum has the Autonomous Driving Network Initiative, has levels. But potentially what's additional in this model is it's not just looking at the application, but it's also looking at the security and privacy protection. And we believe that's the key point in the whole risk-based approach, is that as you look to build intelligence into applications, you also look to increase the security and privacy protection capability that's needed in a matching way. There are various domain scenarios that you could look to point these. I've given some suggestions on the right-hand side. But to be honest, they're only suggestions, because the risk-based approach does depend on the domain. It depends on the actual region and the ultimate regulatory environment that's involved. So this is something that will vary, but I think it would be great for the industry to have a shared view around the AI cybersecurity model. And this is a contribution which we'll be looking to communicate and workshop with the industry going forward, and to contribute into the standards development process. Another piece of information that was in the document, that was in the text, and I thought it was worthy to put it in a table, because I found it a very useful reference myself, because it mentions a whole bunch of different AI technologies, and it matches them up to different areas of security and privacy protection, which I think is very useful, particularly if you're working in one area, but maybe you're a security person, but maybe not so focused on data, or vice versa, or you're an industry business person, and you're just trying to get your head around what all this AI and security is all about. Now, to be honest, any one of these topics, like, for example, secure federated learning in the area of trustworthy and controlled data sharing, is an area in itself that is worth understanding and exploring. And it basically allows you to protect your algorithms by not sharing data, but just sharing the model itself, and the central system can take the insights of the model to actually tune the model and share that out across the different systems or the different users of that particular model. Another important one in this particular category, in my view, is the edge collaboration. Some people, when you're looking at data, and particular different types of data, which might be very sensitive, people are very concerned to keep it close to either the device. For example, Huawei has a rule for our consumer devices that all personal and private data stays on device, and we bring the AI to the device. The same is true for leveraging the edge. You can keep your data in the enterprise or in the home, and that's another way to ensure that data is secure, but also can support other capabilities which are needed for AI, such as having higher latency because the AI processing is closer to the action. Other technologies like differential privacy, a very specialized area of homomorphic encryption, and data filtering technology can all help to the whole area of trustworthy and controlled data sharing. In the space of result explainability, there is pre and post hoc explainability, which is anti-hoc is pre and post hoc is afterwards. So, explain to me before you deploy the AI what actually you're doing and how you do it, and so we can understand how that works. And post hoc, you have to explain afterwards how a decision was made in a particular scenario. Tools for that are being developed in the industry and in open source community to help that make possible, plus it also needs to be part of the development process. Then in the model self-protection, I'll defer to the experts here in the Secure AI team who describe this in the ETSI Secure AI document in more detail, whether it's defense against adversarial attack, model theft prevention, model security detection, secure environments are all key parts of that. And then in system traceability, when the ANISA threat landscape was published, the director of ANISA talked about the importance of the supply chain, and that has been a key area to secure, because as we develop models in our research centers and get them deployed, some of them will be getting deployed to places in the supply chain which are in different locations. So you need to make sure that the AI that's deployed is the AI that was sent out by the particular builder of those AI platforms or the platform provider, and also that the data is secured in this process. And then finally, for the full dynamic capability, you'll see areas like secure reinforcement learning, secure fallback mechanisms. So secure fallback mechanism will be, for example, don't just have one platform for implementing AI intelligence, have multiple, so that if one stops or starts performing incoherently, another one could be relied on to support the process, or you could have multiple votes. And we've seen that in the space program, but it will be applied for robotics and autonomous cars and other areas in order to help ensure safe, reliable operation. So I hope that this is a useful explanation. I certainly found it very useful in my focus on AI security and privacy protection, and something which I think, again, the industry needs to have a common view on and a common table to help all of us speak to getting to different levels. Because when we look to the future, the next steps beyond standards is how do you certify? And to certify, you really need to have a common view about what AI is and what it's been applied for and what levels of capability is needed. So these sorts of terms will be useful in the industry going forward to have a stronger understanding of how to secure AI and privacy protection. So this is all very advanced, and to be honest, probably significantly advanced than many AI applications around the world. There's obviously areas like autonomous cars and robotics that are kind of leading on this, but the average AI application that somebody working on the cloud using AI for statistical or visual processing, or trying to understand the data set to help, for example, understand the use of it by helping to give better recommendations to a user. We'll be using very basic data analytics AI and needing to look at explainability. So that's typically where a lot of the industry is at. So what I wanted to do was to go back to that model on some of the use cases and talk about some of the scenarios and to explain a regional perspective, because this is going to vary by region into how AI could be used and how it will be managed going forward. But it'd be good if we had a common way to look at it, which I'm suggesting in the next 2 slides. Now, I see there's a bunch of questions coming in, but I'll try and keep going and see how to look at those. I may run out of time, and if I do, I may have to come back and follow up on those. But I really appreciate the attendance and the great audience that we have here today. So in Huawei, as we talk about the intelligent digital world, as a matter of fact, the screen behind me here in the Cybersecurity Center talks about the threat landscape in the intelligent digital world. So it's very appropriate. You can look at some of the challenges, whether it's whatever industry you're operating, whether it's in smart city, whether it's Industry 4.0, finance, transport, devices, as I mentioned, and more automated areas, autonomous areas like using autonomous drones or automotive or robotics will all involve the use of AI. And ultimately, it's building an AI pipeline, which needs to be protected. And as mentioned earlier, we have the model training phase, which is looking at data processing, and then the model generation, and then the model inference phase, looking at deployment. So at Huawei, the key role is that we like to think is that Huawei, as a technology provider, is enabling solution providers, service providers, and application developers build AI pipelines. Now, we're going to look at focusing on this in terms of some of the roles and the technology going forward. So here's some examples of intelligent digital world and some of the examples of use cases, for example, in China. So, for example, starting off with the autonomous driving cars, obviously this is at the very top of the stack at the high automated intelligence area that I mentioned. And to have that level of capability is something that the whole industry in automotive is focusing on, and it's going to be a key element as regards supporting that intelligent driving capability. But it's not just about the car itself, it's also about transport and smart cities. And I've been to China now many times, and the scale is enormous. When you have cities of 20 or more people, 20 million people or more, and 18-lane highways, having toll booths stopping all that traffic is a nightmare. So those cities are moving more and more to autonomous monitoring and collection of the tolls, so that there can be a free flow of traffic, and that's something that's greatly appreciated by the citizens, so that they can travel in these highly congested cities going forward. But it's also to support the city planning, because if you want to have a smooth flow, you need to understand the flow of the traffic and make adjustments as you go forward, in particular as you bring that traffic into the city. How can you get more intelligence and help to create a smarter city going forward? And then another one, which is supported from our cloud in Hong Kong for environmental protection for an NGO based out of the Amazon in Puerto Rico. There's devices sitting on trees, solar powered, recycled mobile phones, and these devices are listening out for the environment to see has anybody been cutting down trees. So here you have a very basic device collecting audio data and sending that to the cloud for processing, and then when a good social responsibility use case. So here you can see a few different scenarios of applying intelligence in China, but there are so many more. Some will involve edge capability, and some will involve cloud and combinations thereof. But they all involve this technology stack, which I'm showing you here, which could be any vendor's technology stack based around networking, computing, and the algorithm layer. And I've deliberately shown the algorithm layer as a hybrid because in several of our customer environments, they would maybe develop the algorithms maybe on other platforms and to our environment. So there's a very open environment, and Huawei's AI, like other vendors, is open sourced, and it's a way to help have greater visibility to what is in the algorithm layer and to help build a trustworthy AI capability. But ultimately, and this is why the top partners and their customers, and Huawei in China also has a focus on supporting those solutions, and we do act as a service provider for cloud in China, so we do have a support for our development portal, our O&M, and cybersecurity in that market. However, as we go to other regions, and for example in Europe, here we've taken a different model. We have the same focus on the top, the application layer and the data layer, and can bring algorithms onto the algorithm layer. And Huawei acts as a technology provider to support the service provider, solution providers platforms for networking, computing, and algorithm capability. But the development portal, the O&M, and cybersecurity are totally in the hands of our partners. And again, it kind of shows you how this simple little layered technology stack can help to give a common definition for how the intelligent world could be realized. Some of the example scenarios that are in this I can kind of finish on that I think are worth mentioning. One of our partners is looking and has developed an ability to support COVID health protection with an intelligent health and safety solution, can detect face masks on staff coming into the centres, and obviously there would be the natural awareness on the doors of these facilities that they're using video processing and they have an application like this running. But this can then be used then to give a soft reminder to the people coming in, suggesting probably a good idea if you put on the face mask while you're walking around the office. This particular scenario, I've seen other partners look at using it for things like protecting people in construction sites, for high-vis jackets. When you have a couple of thousand people on the building site, it can be very difficult for the site foreman and the site health and safety officer to understand, is everybody wearing their high-vis or is everybody wearing their helmets? So there is ways using the technology to support these applications using AI, and to ultimately create a healthier and safer world for everyone. Another interesting scenario with a French company is intelligent retail, intelligent catering, where they have built an application that can look at your tray. Now, if you've ever been to our campus in Shenzhen or some of the other campuses in China, they're rather big, 30,000 people working there, and when you have 30,000 people going to lunch, that can be quite a big line. So it's very important that we can help process those as quickly as possible. So working with this independent partner, they developed this application because they're our innovation partner for catering and look after all of our catering across Huawei globally. They built an intelligent application that can detect what's on the tray and help to automate the processing for the people who are doing the checkouts, or indeed have the capability for 24 automated for a trusted environment. I think that's interesting about this is it's an AI application developed in China with a Chinese partner by a French company, and they'll be looking to bring that application to Europe and around the world as to support their global business. So that's where the importance of standards is going to be critical, because we need to have a shared view around what is good AI and also how that AI is developed, so that we can help to have a global economy, but also support the needs of a partner who has built an application to be able to bring this around the world, regardless of where it's developed. And then we have another partner focusing on Industry 4.0 that is looking at intelligent robotics. Now, in a lot of factories, you may have seen cars in the car manufacturing factories, for example, and the robots are in cages. And that's because they operate at really high speed. They're very automated, and they really help to achieve the efficiencies that's driving today's supply chain for automotive. But they're behind cages and they're relatively static. So what happens then when you want to have robots in an environment like a warehouse where you may also have people? So now you have to have a robot that is intelligent to be able to navigate outside a cage, but also to be able to detect humans so that it can avoid them or stop if there's a critical, somebody steps out in front of them, or also to be useful in the context of detecting objects or to finding things in a warehouse. So that intelligent robotics is also another interesting area. And again, we've worked with partners who have built their AI and been able to bring that AI, which was developed actually in this case on another platform, and be able to bring it onto the Huawei environment for the inference and deploy it going forward. So this openness application, whether it's deploying it on different AI platforms, whether it's deploying in different regions, and being open to leveraging AI to do new things in the health and safety area, I think are all part of the reality that we will need to support for enabling and supporting the intelligent digital world. So going forward then, I would like to kind of summarize and talk about the what I've covered. I've tried to look at giving you a high-level managerial view about what AI is and some of the things you should need to think about as regards understanding the threat landscape, and suggestions for more information, whether it's with ANISA or with the ETSI Secure AI team, or indeed your own cybersecurity initiatives in this country. I also looked at talking about the shared responsibility model and why I would really look to engage to see how we can have a really shared view of that model and get to a common understanding of that model across the industry. This challenges on AI is something that many vendors are going to be supporting, with multiple service providers to support many customers and partners around the world. So having this shared view, and this conference is really great to have different players in the industry coming together and people sharing their experiences, I think is the kind of forum that's important to have that shared understanding. And then finally, each region will have its own specific model, and service providers and solution providers in the region will be important as regards supporting the model that's needed to support your needs for the Arab cybersecurity industry as you look to adopt and leverage AI solutions going forward. So with that, I'll kind of come to the end of my presentation, and I hope it's been useful. We look forward to continuing the conversation. We have cybersecurity centers based around the world, not just here in Europe, but in different countries. And we're very interested to continue the dialogue so that we can learn more about your challenges and provide some of our insights and facilitate this industry dialogue that we think is important for the industry going forward.